The Telerine, Book 1, House of Captives. Part 1, Foundation. Chapter 1, Go. Go to Hechtel. Kessid scrunched his small face. What was that, he wondered. He felt sand. He felt it beneath him as he lay there on his back, too afraid to open his eyes. The question of why he was lying atop sand could be answered in a number of ways, none of them any good. He took a breath, held it a moment, then popped open his overly large brown eyes, and what he saw took his breath away. There were stars, millions of them. The world was dark. Why was it dark out? That didn't make any sense. The world had been living in one giant long day, a true long day, a period of 297 years of constant sunlight, since it left the orbit of Dolmesh, the greater sun, long before Kessid was born, and his birth had taken place during the middle of the 99-year orbit around Kotmesh, the lesser sun, in which the lands of Adar were flooded with its light unceasingly for all 20 hours of each day span. Daylight had been all he'd ever known, and everyone expected that constant daylight to last for several more months, until Kotmesh's day-night cycle would begin. It was supposed to be a year-long period of 10 hours of full light from both suns, alternating with 10 hours of only the dim light from distant Dolmesh, which hung suspended in space a distance of 99 Adaran years away from the world's current orbit around the little sun. So again, why now was it dark? Kessid sat up suddenly and looked around briskly, like some small rodent poking its head above ground, his messy brown hair flopping and swinging around him. Everywhere, all around, it was just sand below and stars above. He lifted a four-fingered hand and scratched his smooth chin. The 8 fingers, 2 thumbs and 3 fingers, of his hands were a trait of his people, the Artmari. His smooth cheeks and brown eyes were oddities. Whereas most Artmari had red irises, his had always been brown. He assumed he had been born that way, though he couldn't know for certain, as he'd never known his parents, but had been raised by the monastery of the Order of Silence since his early childhood. And his beard, his poor beard, well, that had never come in. He had the face of an infant. He sighed deeply. Aside from the fingers and his size, half that of the average Admari, the other short-life race, he was very un-Artmari-like indeed. He wondered. Sand. He knew of only one place like that, though he'd never been there before. The Dusty Sea? Adar's single desert, spanning the vast middle portion of the fin-shaped continent. It was so far from home, a place he would never travel to, and yet here he stood. And what was that, he wondered? Go to Hechtel. There it was again. A voice, deep and clear. Why was it speaking to him? And why should he go to Hechtel of all places? What could be in Hechtel besides factories and mud? Could it be him? He wondered. He looked up again. There in the black sky was the familiar sigil of Artana, sovereign of his people, the Artmari. The mountain peak constellation stood proud in the northern sky. To the west was the sigil of the Admari sovereign, Admana, his great tree shining bright as usual. And in the eastern sky, there was the constellation of the crescent moon, the sigil of Rochana, sovereign of the chosen first race, the Rochai. Those shining images were always there, however, day and night, visible regardless of the season or the location of Adara around either sun, or when it traveled between them. He scanned around the rest of the sky. For all its sparkling contents, no other constellation was visible. Void night, he thought, the month which bore no sigil of its own. An anomaly among the other 9 months of the Adaran year, which each bore a sigil. Now he knew where he was and when, but why was he here? And how did he get here? And more importantly, how would he get home? He could not survive a 1,000-mile trek through the desert. His short Artmar legs wouldn't carry him but a few hundred miles at most before he collapsed and breathed his last. He looked north again along the horizon. Faint and small, he could just make out what he knew to be the Clawgap Mountains. He shuddered. He had heard tales of the Onagi, fearsome giants, who lived beyond them. He knew deep down it was just a bedtime story, a metaphor, but he shuddered nonetheless and said a silent prayer. He looked beside him. There stood a susel tree, fuzzy and solitary. "What are you doing way out here?" Kessid wondered. "Lost like me?" He just smiled and waved politely at it. Being a silent one, he couldn't speak to it, of course, and risk affecting Alma's creation in some way with the breath. It was the oath he bore upon him as a silent one. Another thing he had lived with all his life, or at least since his earliest memories. He scratched his head again and looked down. His white robes of Alma were all dingy now from the sand and dust that surrounded him. He just couldn't understand it. How and why was he here? And what was that voice? Just then, a dull thump boomed behind him and the ground shook, causing him to stumble forward. He heard a deep, rumbling growl as he tried to regain his footing, but the world shook again, and before he could do anything else, he felt a massive hand, fingers almost as long as he was tall, grab hold of him, the fleshy tree trunks curling around him and squeezing so tight he felt every bone in his body would snap and crumble to powder within him in an instant. He almost yelled out as the hand turned him around, suspending him above the ground, forcing him to look directly at it. The terrifying visage of a fearsome creature, whose head was as large as Kessid. Its stringy dark hair hung in its face, but behind it, giant eyes black as soot, gleamed in the red moonlight of large Doldame, the lower moon. It opened its sinuous jaws, revealing terrible sharp teeth over half a foot long. Just as it moved Kessid toward its open maw, Kessid squeezing his eyes tightly as he turned his face away from the giant, he heard it again, go to Hechtel. He felt one more squeeze, then awoke from his dream.